I guess is maybe a place to begin. Prosoche, for anyone that didn't hear our conversation on In Search of Wisdom, what is it? Why does it matter? And then specifically, how did your interest in Stoic mindfulness come to be? Because not everyone necessarily focuses on this aspect of Stoicism.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. The word prosoche, I think the first place I ever saw it was the things written by Chris Fisher over at the Stoicism on Fire and Traditional Stoicism website and podcast, that they say it's the first step on the path of the prokopton. So again, it's learning all these ancient Greek words. But it's interesting to learn ancient Greek words because we try to translate them, but really understanding them is a different story than just the way they're translated. So the best word for prosoche is focused attention, but it's especially used as this idea of a spiritual practice for developing as a philosopher or an early student of philosophy, that you have to really pay attention to what your mind is doing, right? Your impressions, how you're reacting to things, and that's a necessary step to improve, to get better, to understand yourself, to notice if you're following all the teachings of, the sages and the great writers of philosophy, or are you just trying to apply them, but you're not paying attention to yourself.
It seems to be so critically important, at least in
Yeah.
in my view. I've discussed and written a number of short articles that I put out of, like, say for example, dichotomy of control. Most people are familiar with this, but you run into like a real issue, and that's where I think you get into mindfulness in actually implementing what's up to us, what's not up to us. Because if you
Yeah.
honestly try to apply this in your life, at least in my experience, you're hit very quickly with the fact that you desire to control things that are not within your control.
Yeah.
Or, this training our desire and aversion, basically the things that we don't want. There are things that happen that we don't like. So we
Yeah.
get into this desire and aversion thing, which is in Buddhism, there's thousands of pages on
Yeah.
this, how to do it. Then you get into Stoicism because it's just really important in life, but there's not a lot written on it. How do you think about applying it, and maybe if there's any thoughts in terms of, Buddhist meditation practice and stuff like
Yeah,
that?
that's my interest because as a therapist, what I work with people on a lot is mindfulness. It's an important step, I think, before you can do CBT, before you can notice your automatic thoughts and change your thoughts to change your feelings. You have to notice them. And then how do you get better at that? So this idea of really basic mindfulness. What is mindfulness even before you get into this, noticing? Um, so the separation I make is mindful practices, which are just paying attention, just getting really, really good at paying attention to whatever, right? That could be just looking, going for a walk and noticing what's around you, going, looking out your window and just seeing what's there, right? To do painting or to do visual arts is kind of a great practice for that. To notice your body and, what comes up, right? Can you feel pain? Do you feel an emotional reaction, right? That's a good things to notice. And then the second part is the attitude. So that's in Buddhism, right? It's non-judgment or non-attachment, right? So you observe these things and then you try to observe them with that attitude. So whenever you're observing it without that attitude, you say, okay, let's try to come back to non-judgment. There is a judgment, come back to non-judgment. With Stoicism, the first way I started talking about it in my kind of personal, this is kind of, again, my modern concept of prosoche, because I don't think we can say exactly what the ancients did, or I'm trying to get more educated on it myself, but the idea of how necessary it is seemed clear to me. But as a modern practice, it really is that I think you can bring in those practices from Buddhism where there's a lot written to get better at mindfulness. And that increases your base mindfulness skill or ability. And then you can also apply it to the Stoic attitudes, which are things, yeah, like the discipline of desire, like things like trying to accept fate, which have a
Mm.
little overlap with Buddhism, but then are a little different. So that's, yeah, it's very interesting as I still struggle with it myself. Yeah.
Yeah, likewise. I do as well. And as we were talking about earlier, discernment. and working with people, use the term, if I remember correctly, wise mind. It seems to be that there is a requirement for a bit of detachment from your thoughts and judgment, or
Yeah.
a bit of space. Like, how do we loosen our grip on them a little bit? Because you think about, at least for me, I think sometimes about paying attention, being mindful.
Yeah.
It seems like you could do that and do some very evil things and do some very destructive things for
Yeah.
your life, for others. So there needs to be this thing of, because if we do have a dark side, if we do have, a potential capacity for evil along with good, then we have to be able to wisely discern the wise choice, the unwise choice, or helpful, useful type of thing. Sometimes when I think about stoicism, or I am, reading ancient stoic texts and things like that, it's almost like they're going straight to integrating it in daily life.
Yeah.
Like the judgments and working with it, you're in everyday life. And it's like it's for someone that has a few years of a stillness practice
Yeah.
under their belt. Because Buddhism is the same way, that it's not just I'm going to do this on the cushion. It's
Yeah.
it's supposed to translate into everyday life. And I just wonder, is it possible without, a few years of some sort of stillness practice?
Right.
Another rambling
And
question thrown
it's
your
very
way.
strange, yeah, when they don't write about what those things are, because probably they learned it just like from their teacher, right? There was a teacher who sort of would catch what they were doing wrong, right? And then when they're writing, they're kind of writing to, yeah, the ideal sage they want to be, right? They're trying to get to that, being the sage, reminding themselves, here's where you need to be, right? But they're not really, yeah, walking through the steps before that. One of my thoughts is kind of like that you were saying earlier, the noticing your desires, right? You're trying to do this dichotomy of control, but then you have these desires. So you have to notice them, right? You have to admit them and that there's like a feeling there, right? So you want to be detached and you want to say there's no feeling there. But if there really is a feeling there, you stop, you're mindful, you notice, oh, it's there. And like you said, if you're about to do something that's evil, hopefully you could stop and notice that. You could notice, oh, I'm going to feel guilty. This is going to cause problems if you want to be aware of it. So that's starts with that really core level of being like, oh, why does this feel bad, right? Why does this feel, I'm feeling something here when I'm about to take this action. What's that about? Um, this goes back to that idea, the really core mindfulness I think you need before you just jump into meditating and trying to be enlightened or the Stoic idea. Yeah.
How do you think we separate from our thoughts? If you think from a practical standpoint of
Yeah.
relationships, you have a spouse, or
Yeah.
relationships at work, you might have a desire, even though you know that these other people are outside of your control, but there is a desire for a spouse, colleagues to behave in a certain way.
Yeah.
How do you think about working with those desires in a healthy way, and eventually, loosening our grip on those?
In the kind of the, as I call it, the conventional psychology perspective, which is sort of based on mindfulness based stress reduction, but also in dialectical behavior therapy, it's the definition of what you mean by your judgments, right? You're trying to have this attitude of non judgment, but judgments are separate from your preferences or your emotional reactions. To learn to really separate them and say, okay, I'm thinking of, yeah, something scary happening to my child. I feel fear, but is it a bad thing, right? How can you say it's not a bad thing, right? But that they're all separate processes. You break it down, right? So one is that I'm feeling fear. One is my thought is going, it's predicting the future, right? Because I don't actually know unless the bad thing already happened, right? Or something like that. If we're just fearing it, we desire for it to not happen, right? It hasn't happened yet. You break all those things down. And so then you can admit, okay, that's my fear. I see it here. That's my thought or preference for the future. That's my judgment. But let's try not to judge it as much. So you don't have to lose those other things to say that it's not good or bad. It's just those other things. It's just scary rather than it's good or bad. Um, And I think it really fits in with the Stoicism because then for the Stoics, everything is non-judgment. It's not good or bad, except for when it comes to your virtuous choice. So it's just a
Mm.
slight change on that attitude. It pretty much fits, I think.
Not everybody talks about it that way of
Yeah.
it's not good or bad. I just posted something recently of
Yeah.
seeing beyond good and bad,
Yeah.
and it was basically around training desires and
Yeah.
aversions. Why do you why did you put it in that particular thing of not seeing good or bad?
I think because it still is something, right? That whatever our desire is, it's a thing you feel in your body. It's thoughts that pass through your mind. It's not that it's nothing, but is it that judgment of this is a terrible thing, this is a great thing? Is it that desire of good or bad?
Mm,
So I think that's part of that, trying to not desire it yet noticing the urge to kind of desire it, right? I think that's the like the proto emotion. I like that term from the Stoics. Um, that's there, but then the assenting to the impression that it's good or bad maybe is one way to say that.
mm.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I like how in Zen Buddhism, it seems like, at least I've read in Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, and I think a couple
Yeah.
other places of emptiness, but not in the way of, there's many different definitions of that, but just in the way of our particular words or judgments that we assign to things in a certain way. They're empty because it's our own personal perspective of that. It doesn't
Yeah.
necessarily make it true. That's just how we're perceiving it. I think some of that type of stuff is really important, but also difficult to understand and realize, like in the moment, like when it comes
Yeah.
to a relationship, your particular spouse, or like I
Yeah.
said, colleagues and things like that. There there is a judgment. There is a thing that we're thinking of, is there's a right way to do something. This
Yeah.
is right, and how other people are behaving, we have categorized it, put it in this category of
Right.
bad or wrong, but we don't necessarily realize that, oh, wait, it's not really that. That's just
Yeah.
our perception. It's a subjective thing.
Right. That the practice of how do you get better at non-judgment is you observe and you describe your judgment. So rather than saying, I don't have any judgments, they're gone, it's there was a judgment. Oh, there it was again, right? So you're actually putting words to it. And I think it fits what you're saying. As you practice doing that more and more, something about them becomes more empty, right? Rather than just feeling true, right? Feeling good or bad. It's I could put that label on it, or I could not, right? I could say it a different way. So I just put a label on it again. And now I could not do that. So that's the thing that you practice, right? And I think it fits whether it's under Buddhist mindfulness or Stoic mindfulness. That's a thing you can get better at. Yeah.